Here are all the first-time watches and rewatches I saw in July of 2023. Starting off the year, I watched my very first movie from the Polonia brothers, Splatter Farm. And I would describe this movie as the gory, twisted, deformed child of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre shot on VHS. This thing is 100% regional, disgusting, and has one scene that'll make any person wince in the grossness, which I felt amps up the disgusting factor since it's shot on video. And if you're looking for a seminal shot on video gore film, check out Splatter Farm. Next, I watched White Zombie on a new Blu-ray that I got from Gold Ninja Video. Since this was the first time seeing this, I really tie my experience in with this Blu-ray, since it's presented as an experience complete with horror host segments. It was a wonderful experience, aided by the fact that a real storm is happening when I watched it. It is dense with 1930s atmosphere, and the lack of music throughout makes a complete mood package. Next, I watched Light Sleeper by Paul Schrader. I've been making my way through his filmography, and with this movie, it was another banger from him. Willem Dafoe is amazing as an ex-junkie drug dealer, and I think perfectly sells the midlife crisis that he's going through throughout the duration of it. The attempt at rekindling a past romance is genuinely sweet and very crushing all in one. It has wonderful quiet scenes where we just hold on the two characters talking with a certain action or expression that completely changes the dynamic of the scene. It's a great mood piece into the nightlife of an ex-junkie drug dealer. After that, I watched Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. The first three movies are an incredible milestone in my life, and I remember seeing Crystal Skull in theaters when I was little and thinking it was just okay. And that's essentially what I think about this movie. It's just okay. I don't see myself rewatching it, which is kind of a shame because it's an Indiana Jones movie. But there were stretches of this movie where I found myself getting very bored with the action. And that's probably my biggest complaint with it. Harrison Ford and Phoebe Waller-Bridge were great in it, but that's about the most standard praise I can give it. I didn't walk out of the theater excited, just the most basic meh I could think of. Next up, I watched Dagon, a later film by Stuart Gordon, and I really liked this movie. I remember seeing bits and pieces of this movie on the Sci-Fi Channel all the time, specifically the ending, but never watched the whole thing. And I think it's one of the best Lovecraft adaptations. It's relentlessly paced. Basically, the entire movie is one long chase through a dark and stormy night throughout this creepy seaside town, with the town's residents being these fishmen hybrids that look great. And towards the end contains an incredibly graphic scene that reminded me a lot of the scene in Bone Tomahawk. And if you've seen that movie, then you know exactly which one I'm talking about. After that, I watched Clean Shaven from 1993 starring Peter Green. I loved this movie. I had never heard about this movie before, and it was a total blind watch for me. This has some of the best sound work in any movie I have ever seen in my life. Peter Green plays a recently released man who suffers from schizophrenia. The director Lodge Kerrigan wants to put the viewers inside Green's head and truly pulls it off in an assault of images and sound. I've never experienced anything like this, and I'm still thinking about some of the sound work in it. While not being a horror movie per se, it still has some incredibly horrifying images in it. If you're going to watch this movie, watch it with the best pair of headphones that you can find and get absorbed with this super disturbing world. After that, I watched a TV movie from 1988 called In the Line of Duty, The FBI Murders. What caught my attention with this one was that it was a rare villain turn for Michael Gross, and that is the main reason to watch this movie. He is fantastic and menacing in this movie, and I wish he played villains more often because he just does it so well. And it is by no means an outstanding movie, but it has some very tense set pieces involving Michael Gross. The ending shootout is so well staged and blocked. You know where everyone is in relation to each other, and it does make you want to read into this real-life event that happened on this really horrific day. Next, I saw Class of 1999, which was a very fun watch. If you're in the mood for an exploitation movie from the 90s, this and Freeway by Matthew Bright would be my go-to choices. This film has so much character and builds upon aspects that were established in Class of 1984 by the same director, in which It's essentially an inversion on that concept, but with homicidal robots for teachers. I do think it drags a little bit in the middle, but that last act really picks things up and makes it a complete experience and a wonderful watch. Next, I watched a movie from 1985 called Movers and Shakers, which stars Walter Matthau and Charles Grodin. If I had to give an example of a movie that is an empty void of nothing, I would point to this movie, which is so unfortunate given the talent on screen and the fact that it was written by Charles Grodin, and it really did seem like a passion project for him. But you can see the studio meddling all over this thing, to where it doesn't even seem like a real or completed movie in the end of it. I really wanted to give it the benefit of the doubt, since I heard that Grodin had such a tough time behind the scenes with it, and it has this narration on it that just does not fit. And I was hoping that I could come to this mic and say that this practically unknown movie from the 1980s would be a highlight, but unfortunately, it wasn't at all. On the flip side of that comedy, the next thing I watched from another well-respected comedic actor was Defending Your Life, which was an incredibly sharp contrast to go from Movers and Shakers to this. I had the biggest smile on my face while watching this. The philosophical ideas that it brings to the plate of the afterlife is so interesting, while also finding the comedic aspects of it through the character played by Albert Brooks. But the two shining lights in this movie are Rip Torn, who turns in the nicest and most sweetest performances I've ever seen from any actor, and especially coming from him. But the other shining light is Meryl Streep, who absolutely sells the love that grows between her and Brooks. It brings about the concept of two soulmates that literally meet in the afterlife and perfects this idea. And this movie has so much optimism throughout it and brings about how you can look at two aspects of two very different perspectives, and that's what I love about it. Next, I watched Lenny from 1974, starring Dustin Hoffman and directed by Bob Fosse. All That Jazz is one of my favorite movies. For the longest time, I knew that Lenny ties directly into that movie if you've seen All That Jazz. Given that the equivalent of Lenny to Bob Fosse is the comedian to Roy Scheider's character Joe Gideon, Lenny is a highly original and unique way of presenting a biopic of Lenny Bruce. I think this cutting back and forth from a stand-up act in his early life as a comedian keeps up the pace with this movie. And it only helps that you have Dustin Hoffman in the center of it, giving one of his best performances alongside another wonderful performance by Valerie Perrine. After that, I watched another entry into one of my favorite subgenres, the killer alligator / crocodile subgenre. And that movie was 2007's Croc with Michael Madsen. Is this movie good? Not at all. Is it entertaining? It kinda is. But I love this genre so much that even when something like this movie is kind of bland, I still have a great time watching it. And it has all the tricks up its sleeve in presenting the killer croc, from clear stock footage, pretty good looking animatronics, and 2000 CGI. You have the full package with this one, especially if you're in that mood. Next, I watched the pseudo-documentary Punishment Park. The premise being that in an alternate future, prisoners and political prisoners are given a choice of serving their time in prison or doing 3 days in Punishment Park, where they have to run from one point of a wide open desert to the other side, where an American flag is. All the while, they are being hunted and used as target practice by the police. This whole thing is an incredibly raw piece of filmmaking, with the standout being the actors from everyone involved. There is no performance that stands out as, I'm an actor in a fake documentary. They are all believable, especially in the scenes involving the police and the court interviewing them. I've seen this categorized as a horror movie in the past, and while it is a horrifying idea, I would put this more towards a political thriller mixed with a Mondo film. Next, I watched Michael Haneke's The Seventh Continent. I picked this movie up as a part of the trilogy put out by Criterion. I'm slowly chipping away at his filmography, and so far this is the third one from him that I've seen, with Funny Games US and Cash Eye being the other two. His films, to me, are frustrating in a good way. They defy the conventional nature of movies, and he dares to challenge the viewer. And this is something that you'll always hear from everybody, is his defying the conventional nature of movies and just how he loves challenging the audience. And I'll be honest, when I first saw Funny Games US, that was the very first movie of him that I'd seen, and I went into it blind, not knowing who he was or his intentions with that movie. And I distinctly remember leaving that movie absolutely hating it. I hated everything about it, but it's one that I never forgot. I then saw Caché, and by this point, I knew who he was, and I knew what his intentions were, and I prepared myself for what I was going to see. And I had the complete opposite reaction. I loved it. I absolutely loved Caché. And it made me reflect on Funny Games US, and it made me appreciate what he was doing with that movie beforehand. Now with this movie, The Seventh Continent, it's equally as frustrating, but in a good way, as his other movies. There is so much care put into every single frame of this movie, and one that makes you reflect on what you just witnessed, and it'll make you bring what you feel is the cause of what happens to this family in the end. You have to bring your own meaning to this. He does not spoon feed it to you at all. So every single person that sees this movie will have their own unique and different perspective. The next movie I watched is the complete reverse, which is The Front Page from 1974 by Billy Wilder, starring Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon. Starting off, Billy Wilder is one of my favorite directors. I love Matthau and Lemmon together. Matthau in particular is one of my all-time favorite actors. There's something about his deadpan delivery that is so infectiously fun. And I'm not sure when it comes to this movie if this will be a controversial opinion or not. I think it's probably their weakest film together that I've seen, and it's by no means a bad movie. In fact, I really enjoyed this, but out of all their collaborations, I would put their movie, Buddy Buddy, slightly above this, which is hated and is seen as a low point for Lemmon, Matthau, and especially Wilder. But with that movie, I really did enjoy it, but I really did enjoy this movie. It does have highlights within it, and to me, all of them stem from Matthau, who commits 100% to his performance and makes you believe that he's worked in the newspaper business all his life. And I would recommend this to any fans of their work. But for me, I don't really see myself revisiting it. Maybe time will tell. Next, I watched The Umbrellas of Cherbourg by Jacques Demy. When it comes to musicals, I would say that this is my least favorite genre, with the exception of some movies in that genre, which are some of my all-time favorites. Little Shop of Horrors, All That Jazz, Singin' in the Rain, and now The Umbrellas of Cherbourg. I absolutely fell in love with this movie, and since seeing it, it has never left my mind for a day. It keeps up a level of energy and emotion that does not let up throughout its 90-minute runtime, which is another feat for it being so short and just so emotionally impactful. And for being a movie where all the dialogue is sung throughout, it is never exhausting. It keeps the pace with this amazing and booming score accompanying the singing. Demy's use of blocking within the frame is right up there with Kurosawa and Spielberg to create such a lively and vibrant scene. And with the use of colors, that is some of the most beautiful uses of it that I've ever seen. It works wonders with contrasting the beautiful colors, beautiful songs, beautiful characters with such a dark, tragic love story. This movie was made in one of my favorite years in movies, 1964, and feels like it could have been made today. I could go on and on about this movie, but I do want to keep this short, so just watch it and see for yourself. After that, I continued my journey into the world of Larry Cohen with Black Caesar, which is essentially a 1973 retelling of Little Caesar with Fred Williamson in place of Edward G. Robinson. Williams is fantastic in the role. His character does some truly awful and shocking things within the movie, but still manages to keep you engaged with him through sheer charisma. The first scene with him entering a barbershop is a perfect showcase for what he can do as an actor. And what Cohen does with him and his character is pit him against one of the sleaziest and scuzziest villains I've seen in any movie, who is played by Art Lund, which makes the movie instantly compelling whenever they are on screen together. In true 70s filmmaking fashion, it has an ending that is so nihilistic and perfectly fits the tone and mood of the world that Cohen creates throughout his entire filmography. Next, I watched Cut and Run from 1985 by Ruggero Deodato. I was really excited to see this one, just based off of the premise, cover, and director, and unfortunately, I was disappointed by this movie. If I had to nitpick this movie, this whole thing needed to be a relentless chase through the jungle. Instead, we don't get that till the middle to last half of the movie, and even then, we keep cutting back out of the jungle and back to the city involving a whole different set of characters. And to me, this absolutely kills the momentum of the movie and just makes certain sections extremely boring to watch. If you could take this premise and make it one long unbroken chase scene and keep it in the jungle throughout the entire duration, you would have an amazing movie. Following this, I watched Rec 3 Genesis. When it comes to the whole Rec series, I love the first one, and the second one has some amazing sequences throughout. And up until this point, I still haven't seen Rec 4. Going into Rec 3, I knew that it would be a departure away from the found footage style, and the movie would move into a traditional style. The first 20 minutes play out as a found footage, and I think that's the best part of the entire movie. The chaos that descends upon this wedding reception reminded me of the infamous staircase sequence in the first Rec. It's chaos, it's scary, and it's so well done. And after this sequence, it switches to your traditional style. Not only that, but it takes on this very abrupt, goofy comedic tone that for me did not work at all. It jarringly switches tones throughout, severely decreasing the horror and the dread, and it almost seems to forget the viciousness of the infected, where one minute they are sprinting and frothing at the mouth and are just wanting to kill these characters, and another they're shambling towards people like regular zombies, and just it really took me out of it. If someone really enjoys this movie though, I would completely understand, but for me it just did not click. Next, I watched The Woman in the Window from 1944, directed by Fritz Lang. Earlier this year, I had watched Scarlet Street, which was also another Fritz Lang movie, and also starred Edward G. Robinson and Joan Bennett. Both movies play well off of each other. The Woman in the Window is a fantastic noir, and it also tackles another one of my favorite subgenres, where the main character tries to cover up an accidental murder, and the whole movie is their plan unraveling. You just feel a sense of darkness and dread creeping up towards Robinson's character. What I think will be divisive about this movie is its ending. It is a big swing, and for some, it might ruin the entire thing. But for me, it worked. And reflecting on everything that came before, the little asides that people have, the randomness of certain things, and the coincidences, I think it all adds up and creates an ending that you may have seen before, but given the fact that this is 1944, I think it all adds up in the end. After that, I watched Triangle from 2009. And this is a movie that you can't really talk about without spoiling what the major hook of it is. It was a fun experience, but overall, I wasn't really blown away by it. The way that they used the location of the boat was the absolute standout. And to me, the thing that I kept thinking of is there is one movie that it heavily reminded me of throughout, which I feel that this movie does better, and the only reason I'm not saying the title is just because it would give away what Triangle is, and I wouldn't want to do that to people who don't know the twist. Aside from that, I really don't have that much to say about it. It was a fun time. Next, I watched one of the craziest viewing experiences I've had all year. Weasels Rip My Flesh from 1979. I don't even know where to start with describing this movie. It's incomprehensible. And I guess you could boil it down to a space shuttle crashes after extracting this goo from outer space, and then the goo causes the local weasels to grow to gigantic size. And then there's a random serial killing that happens that has no effect on anything. It opens with an almost 2-minute long shot of some woods, and there are those awkward pauses between the actors saying their lines, and it just keeps going from there. And I know I'm missing stuff, but it just gets crazier and crazier. All that being said, I implore anybody that loves low budget regional gems to check this out. You have never seen anything like this before, and you never will afterwards. Next, I watched a Western from 1958 by Joseph H. Lewis called Terror in a Texas Town. What interested me about this was the fact that it starred Sterling Hayden and the image of him holding a whaling harpoon in a duel. Not only did I get that delivered, but I also got one of the best classic westerns I've ever seen. Lewis's use of the frame and the blocking of the actors and the camera movement is masterful. There is sequence after sequence where the scene will go on for an unbroken shot, but it feels like 10 different cuts were made. That's how much he's able to change up these dialogue scenes. Not only does he know how to move the camera, but he masterfully uses the wide open landscape in large rooms to establish the scene of the location and know where everyone is to the viewer. Just like this scene in a saloon where he and the editor cuts to a wide shot of the entire wide open room. Nothing major happens in this wide shot, but it does wonders for establishing the location. The only other thing that I have to add to this is that the villain played by Nedrick Young is so wonderfully evil that you're anticipating the showdown between him and Hayden, and it does not disappoint. Next up, I watched one of Peter Jackson's earlier movies called Meet the Feebles. And this was the last of his earlier movies that I needed to cross off my list, aside from Heavenly Creatures. I feel like out of all of his movies, this was the hardest to see availability-wise, and I enjoyed it for what it was. I would say out of his earlier work, this is probably my least favorite, just because I feel like he tries to balance a lot of these characters who are trying to perform a pilot geared towards kids, and you don't really have a central character to ground all of these crazy antics and to take you through this narrative. What shines, though, is Peter Jackson's signature kinetic camera work and direction. It has the slapstick and gross stuff of Bad Taste, but it does at times seem like a trial run for Dead Alive, especially with a romantic subplot and some of the musical cues. I think there are keys to Bad Taste and Dead Alive that are absent with Meet the Feebles. With Bad Taste, you have the backstory of Jackson shooting it over years, which makes it incredibly charming. In Dead Alive, you have a very sweet romance in the center, as well as the tragic story of Lionel and his mother. With Meet the Feebles, I feel there are too many ideas stuffed into it, but it does make for an interesting watch to add to the canon of Peter Jackson. After that, I watched a movie called There's Nothing Out There, and this is a movie that I found through Vinegar Syndrome. This was a fun little surprise, and if you had to boil it down, it's basically Scream before Scream, and it's Scream if you added aliens to it and made it a lot goofier, and it has some wonderful surprises to it. The thing that I really respect about this movie is that it doesn't really show its hand at being as meta as it becomes. You have one central character who is a horror movie buff, and he and his friends go out to a cabin for the weekend, and he starts to say out loud to his friends what would happen in horror movie scenarios. The meta-ness of the film starts out subtle and then gradually picks up until you have a literal character escaping danger by swinging on a boom pole. It's able to sustain that level of humor throughout, even to the last minute, which has one of the best jokes in the movie. Coming off of that, I watched a movie that had been on my radar for a while, Who Will Stop the Rain from 1978 with Nick Nolte, Tuesday Weld, and Michael Moriarty. It was really cool to see Michael Moriarty at such an early stage in his career. He is fantastic, and his chemistry with Nick Nolte in the beginning is incredibly natural. While this is a very well-made movie, the thing that kept it from being a great movie was the kind of sort of romance that develops between Nolte and Weld. Unfortunately, I just didn't buy it and was not really invested in the romance between them at all. I was constantly wanting Michael Moriarty to come back into the picture with Nolte. For most of the movie, Moriarty is captured and separated from Weld and Nolte until the last act. That's where it picks up, which results in an incredibly intense standoff. But by this point, you've been with Weld and Nolte, whose chemistry is just not there for me. It really sags in the middle with a runtime that I really don't feel justifies it. While I did have negative things to say about this movie, it is by no means a bad movie. In fact, if you've been interested in this movie, I would say check it out and see for yourself. After that, I watched The Manchurian Candidate from 1962 by John Frankenheimer, which has been on my watch list forever. It's one of those movies where you feel like you've seen everything from it, from the references to it, and just generally knowing where it all leads to in the end. On a technical level, this and Seconds are Frankenheimer at the top of his game. But that being said, I really wish I enjoyed this movie more than I did. There are long stretches of this movie where honestly I kinda got bored by. I think what caused this is the length. I don't think it needs to be as long as it is. And I've never been the biggest fan of Frank Sinatra as an actor. And I don't know if this will be a controversial opinion, but that's just kind of how I felt. This movie is essentially the start of the political thriller genre that would dominate movies in the 70s, from All the President's Men, The Parallax View, Capricorn 1, and even The China Syndrome. From that perspective, you can see so many early signs of that wave to come in this movie. And with that, I really do respect the movie. This is one of those quintessential movies where if someone loves it, I can completely understand. But for me, it just didn't work. Next up, I saw Barbie, which I really enjoyed, especially seeing it in a packed theater. The thing that most impressed me about this movie were the performances by Margot Robbie and Ryan Gosling. Gosling is wonderful as Ken and taps into the energy that he brought to his role in The Nice Guys, but I think the strongest performance in the movie is Margot Robbie. Having this role alongside completely opposite roles in Babylon and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and even I, Tonya, has really made me realize how much range she has, as well as how much she's willing to throw herself into the role. I think Greta Gerwig's love of musicals really shines throughout, especially a dance number towards the end, which has a direct comparison to Singing in the Rain. Overall, I really enjoyed my time seeing this in the theater. Next, I saw Livid from 2011. The interesting and unfortunate thing about this movie is the fact that when it was made back in 2011, Dimension Films bought it and did nothing with it until last year when it was finally released. I haven't seen the director's most well-known movie, Inside, but I do know a lot about it, and this movie, Livid, definitely falls into the category of the French extreme films. Maybe not as much as Martyrs or High Tension. The production design is the standout. You, the viewer, are sucked into this whole other world with this old dark house that feels like an abyss. If you're in the mood for an old dark house movie with something extremely unsettling happening in one of the rooms, definitely check this out. After that, I watched Shockwaves from 1977. For the longest time, I had heard from people that this is a movie that does not live up to its premise of aquatic Nazi zombies, and that so many people were left disappointed by this movie. I am definitely not one of them. I kind of loved this movie. The visuals throughout of these zombies mixed with the scenery and droning synth score really worked for me. I definitely felt a sense of dread throughout, and this is one of the few movies that honestly feels like a straight up nightmare. Not necessarily that it scared me, but a nightmare where you're in an unknown location and there is a threat that just keeps coming after you. No matter where you hide, they always seem to find you. And this movie captures that so wonderfully. Don't expect a traditional zombie movie. Go into this knowing that it's a slower mood piece and just get absorbed with it. Next up, I watched The Woman from 2011. This is a sequel to Offspring, which I had just watched a few months prior. This movie improves on every aspect of Offspring, even ramping up the brutality of some of the characters and the nihilism. Pollyanna McIntosh is outstanding in this movie, and so is Sean Bridgers, who plays such a disgusting and repulsive character. Every actor in this shines, especially Angela Bettis. She has a scene towards the end that she 100% sells all of this pent-up rage that she has been holding back throughout the entire movie. And I think that this is a perfect example of daytime horror and uses the wooded location perfectly. Next, I watched Penitentiary, an infamous low-budget exploitation movie from 1979. I don't really have much to say on this one. The fight scenes are brutal, with one particular one going on for 8 minutes, and it feels raw. Like these two actors are really trying to kill each other. I think the movie loses focus halfway through, and we stray away from the movie's central and most engaging character, Too Sweet. I am, though, curious to check out the sequel, which came out a few years later. Next, I watched Royal Warriors from 1986 starring Michelle Yeoh. The action set pieces in the beginning and the end are the shining moments in this movie, specifically the ending, which involves a chainsaw. I do think that the movie suffers from having essentially 3 main characters, and when you were first introduced to them, I was kind of confused on their dynamic together and if they knew each other beforehand. Again, the fight scenes are fun and energetic, and aside from that, that's really all I have to say about it. After this, I watched Death of a Cyclist. This again falls into the murder cover-up subgenre that I love. I again don't really have that much to say about this movie. It's a good movie, but there are stretches of this movie that I did find unnecessarily slow, particularly with the subplot involving a student that I felt just didn't need to be there. I then watched They Came Together, which was a wonderful watch. I was not prepared how much of a throwback to the Zaz-style comedies this would be. This fits perfectly in line with Airplane, The Naked Gun, and David Wayne's own Wet Hot American Summer. It soars by at just 83 minutes, and it being a parody of rom-coms just lends itself to so many wonderful jokes and quick blink-and-you'll-miss-it visual jokes. Next, I watched Black Mama, White Mama, starring Pam Grier. This is essentially the 70s exploitation version of The Defiant Ones. While not a great movie, it is slow in a few parts and has way too many characters that derail the forward momentum of our two characters chained together surviving the elements. The one thing that this movie has made me realize is that one of my all-time favorite duos in movies now is Pam Grier and Sid Haig. Whether they are facing off against each other or teaming up, I absolutely adore it when they are on screen. This is only my second Eddie Romero movie, and it did make me miss the style of Jack Hill behind the camera, especially when you have Pam Grier and Sid Haig together. I would say that there are more slower parts to this movie than entertaining, but I just wanted to use this section to gush about Pam Grier and Sid Haig. In a total 180-degree turn, I watched Mirror from Andrei Tarkovsky next. Just for context, up until this point, I've seen Stalker and Ivan's Childhood. I am in no means an expert on Tarkovsky, so the only unique thing I can bring to this topic is my own unique experience with his movies. I try to savor every single one of them. I fell in love with Stalker when I first saw it. His style of direction is one that completely engages me from the start, especially his use of the moving camera. It's even prevalent in his first film, Ivan's Childhood, which I also love. Now with Mirror, this is his most dense and complex movie. There are images from this movie that pop into my head every single day. It has such a fractured structure that it really did throw me through a loop at first. While I think I have a grasp on what it's about, I feel that it will become clearer with time. I love movies that do that very thing, that change and mold into new things over time. If you haven't seen this and are interested, go into it with the mood of each scene and just let it absorb you. After that wonderful experience, I decided to go with something light, the documentary on one of my favorite subgenres called Sharksploitation. If you are also a fan of this genre, then this documentary is not that groundbreaking. In fact, I would compare it to the first part of In Search for Darkness, where with that, I felt that the documentary was very surface level for people just getting into 80s horror. Parts 2 and 3, however, delve into deeper cuts and I felt were better. I feel if there was a part 2 where you could truly dive into the deep cuts of the genre, including all of the adjacent genres, I feel like this could make for something special. But if you're new to the genre, then this documentary would be a great starter. Next, I watched a hard-to-find zombie movie called Nightlife from 1989. Overall, this was a fun ride of a movie. The first and second acts I felt were a little slow, but once that third act hits and you have a group of reanimated corpses, it is a relentless chase film, where I felt that the zombies were straight out of Return of the Living Dead. They are fast and deadly and love using tools. Scott Grimes is one of the highlights of the movie, who really brings some great charisma, which could almost be a throwaway part, and John Astin is also really menacing in his performance. I do wish a majority of the film took place over the course of one long night, where the chaos continues to ramp up, but it mostly saves everything until that final act. After that, I watched another horror movie from the 80s, a backwards slasher called The Prey. And if I could point to a movie that has clear examples of padding, I would point to this movie. There are endless scenes of animal and bug close-ups, complete scenes of a forest ranger playing a banjo, and a whole scene involving a forest ranger debating on eating a cucumber sandwich. And the strangest thing of all, I actually wasn't that bored by this movie. I was absolutely fascinated by how much padding they can cram into this movie, and that fascination and engagement stayed throughout the whole movie. Overall, this is a basic slasher movie with campers and a deformed killer. You don't see the killer until the last 5 minutes, but where I will give this movie props is those last few minutes of the movie, which I feel has an incredibly dark ending. More dark than the ending of Madman. It goes into some Jack Ketchum's off-season territory, which I was not expecting at all. And the very last movie I watched in July was The Flood, which I think was released just a week or two ago, and the movie had me at killer alligators. This movie is essentially Crawl, but if you replace the house with the police station, and then you added in a prison break to it. I'll just get the obvious out of the way. Yes, the alligators don't look good at all. I don't want to harp on that because it is a low-budget VOD movie, and that's just something that you notice right off the bat. Like I have said in the past, I think the thing that ultimately kills this movie is the pacing. If this was cut down to 80 minutes, I feel it would move at a brisk pace. There are some funny kills within the movie. At the very least, if you decide to watch this, there are some entertaining scenes sprinkled throughout. And that's it for the month of July 2023. Thanks for watching.